Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Don Williams, manager of the Richland Operations Office of the ADC. This is going to be a fast-moving and memorable day. There's probably no other town of this size in the U.S. that can lay claim to having as many visiting dignitaries as we have here today in Richland. Foremost among these visiting dignitaries are two before you now. We're very pleased to have General Leslie R. Groves with us and Dr. Glenn T. Seaborg. We also have Deputy General Manager Ed Block with us and Dr. Arnold Fritsch, Special Assistant to the Chairman, and Mr. Edmund Stokely, Assistant Director for Programs from the Division of Public Information at Headquarters. Prior to beginning this press interview, however, Dr. Seaborg has an award to present to Mr. Thomas P. Letty, President of ITT Federal Support Services, and to Mr. Mel Rice, Manager of ITT FSS Transportation and Maintenance Department. This award is for a particularly significant achievement, and that is the reason it's being presented at this time when you ladies and gentlemen are present. Dr. Seaborg, sir?
This award is for the accomplishment of 1 billion passenger miles without an accident. 1 billion passenger miles is the equivalent of one man making 2,091 1/2 round trips to the moon. Now, half a round trip to the moon would be rather embarrassing, so we hope that ITT FSS will continue this safe driving and safe transporting passengers for at least another 857,000 miles to get that imaginary one passenger back from the moon. Now, actually, more than 27 million passengers made average round trips of about 37 miles in compiling this record. When you consider that Hanford transportation runs all day, every day, regardless of weather conditions, it turns out to be a remarkable record indeed. This billion-mile run is a credit to ITT FSS and to its fine drivers, mechanics, and maintenance workers, for I know the buses couldn't operate so well without a lot of service. And we're proud that this record was made at an AEC installation. And this is the trophy presented to the Federal Support Services Incorporated and its employees in recognition for their remarkable attainment of the 1 billion passenger miles without injury.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seaborg. On behalf of she'll be very happy, very proud to receive it. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you, Don.
I think now we'll call on our visitors for opening statements. Dr. Seaborg, please.
Well, I don't know that I have any particular opening statement. It is a great pleasure to be back here for this 25th anniversary reunion and to see so many of my old friends, the people that were instrumental in making this project such a success. I couldn't help but note that perhaps we're still in a pioneering spirit out here. This River Shore Motel, Motor Inn, being in a early state of development, much like the guest house and the other places for our residences during the war, being in the same situation. I think that's all that I'd like to say at this time.
I have nothing to say, excepting that after what Dr. Seaborg said, I would like to remind anybody who lived here during my regime that never would we have had all this plush carpeting on the floor and a few of the other plush things I see around. But you're not paying for it anyway, are you?
No, not this time. This is part of the our shift to normal methods of operation that's been going on for a long time at Richland.
I would like to add to that one thing, and that is that when we originally planned Richland, it was done with the idea that possibly and quite probably that it eventually would turn into privately owned or place. And that's the reason, one of the reasons it was located where it has been, and one of the reasons for the initial layout of the town.
Dr. Seaborg, 25 years ago, when this whole thing started, did you think that nuclear energy and atomic power would go as far as it has in the past 25 years?
Well, it's somewhat difficult to try to go back and recapture one's feelings as long ago as that, but insofar as I can recall, I would say that the answer would have to be no. I didn't think that it would come this far in this length of time. I know there have been those who have thought that that the progress in the peaceful uses of atomic energy have been slower than they expected. But from my point of view, I would say that where we are today is further along than I would have deemed possible 25 years ago.
I'd like to add to that in 1945, I anticipated that we would have our first breakthrough in the sense of use by the civilian economy of the first economical reactors in about 1965 with the all future power plants, unless there were exceptional circumstances, being nuclear from about 1970 on. That's just about the way it's worked out. Maybe a year or two better than I anticipated, but not much more. But in the beginning, the consensus of opinion that I could gather was that well, we just were hopeful the bomb would work and that out of that would come something useful. And the first report that mentioned it was to the President was made in August of 43, which was the second report. The first one was made in December of 42. And in August of 43, there was a paragraph about that long that said that we were quite hopeful that this development would have several uses other than the bomb.
I might say that I don't disagree with that so far as the use of nuclear energy to generate electricity is concerned. I think that I would have projected that to be on about the time scale that we have found to be the case. But in terms of the broad applications, the broad peaceful uses of atomic energy, the possibilities that it could be used in space, both for the propulsion of nuclear rockets and for auxiliary power, the possibilities for its use in the plowshare program for excavation and on all of the underground nuclear engineering. The possibilities for the use of the radioactive isotopes in medicine and industry and agriculture, even the possibilities that it might power an artificial heart, all of the possibilities in the humanities, in insect eradication, for the mutations to produce new kinds of crops, and things of that sort, and I could mention many, many more, are beyond my predictions, or I believe almost anybody's ability to predict at that time. But as far as the generation of electricity is concerned, it's difficult to decide. We had our ups and downs. Sometimes we thought it would be sooner than other times. I would say that the present status would be consistent with any views that I might have had about it. Oh, maybe not 25 years ago. That's so soon after the chain reaction, but around that time.
Dr. Seaborg, I wonder, without the Manhattan Project, without the need to develop a destructive weapon kind of was involved in that project, if nuclear development would be anywhere near the spot it is now.
No, the peaceful uses would not have been anywhere near as far along as they are now. It would have been much longer in developing, at least a decade longer, if it hadn't had that spur of necessity during the war.
Dr. Seaborg, what do you see in the future for Hanford and Hanford work? Do you see a decrease or an increase in production or weapons?
I don't really know. This is a matter that's under continuous evaluation. The requirements for plutonium for weapons use are basically set by the Department of Defense, so that I don't believe that at this time I'd be able to give you any meaningful answer.
What role do you expect the AEC to continue to play in the development of peaceful uses of nuclear energy?
Well, I think the AEC will continue to play the role that it has in all of these areas that I have mentioned. It is the policy of the AEC, as we develop the peaceful uses of nuclear energy in these various areas, to turn them over to private enterprise. And as you know, this big upsurge in the use of nuclear power to develop electricity that has just taken place, by the way, General Groves, in the last 2 or 3 years, is taking place largely in the domain of private enterprise. And we're going on to the next step. The AEC is developing the more efficient reactors, the advanced converters and the breeder reactors that will use the fuel more efficiently, which it is necessary to develop if nuclear energy is going to play the role in our future that it's capable of. Well, in each of the areas that I mentioned, that is the road, that is the path that is being taken. In the use of radioisotopes, we first produce them and develop applications and so forth, and then as industry is ready, they go into the production. We withdraw from the production, and they begin to develop more and more uses on their own, and so forth, for each of the many areas of the peaceful uses of atomic energy. So we will continue in these areas and other areas, in advanced stages of these areas and new areas. It has been my experience that as one area is developed to the point where it can be taken over by industry and the AEC drops out, more than one new area comes in, shows its potential, and the AEC then becomes involved in the development of that area.
Dr. Seaborg, what do you see as the possibility of the use of the additional land on the Wahookie slope within the 5 miles of coal zone, and then the other 5,000 acres under consideration for energy purposes? What sort of timetable?
Well, I believe that it's possible, it's quite possible that we'll be able to release land on the Wahookie slope for grazing purposes within a matter of half a year or something like that. It's difficult to estimate just what time it will take to make the necessary arrangements. Is that too optimistic?
No, that's about right.
Dr. Seaborg, do you see the possibility of some new breakthrough in atomic weapons, say an N-bomb or a gravity bomb or something like that in the future?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer. It isn't a discontinuous process, and it doesn't seem to me like it will be a discontinuous process. And by that I mean there will be numerous improvements. And this will continue, both in the offensive and the defensive weapons. And that's why we need to stay in the development game, because it is a dynamic area. And the possible improvements in both the offensive and defensive parts of the game is something that we must stay abreast of.
What about some new breakthrough, a new type of weapon, like a neutron bomb or gravity bomb or something?
Well, I would still say that my previous remarks would apply. In other words, the N-bomb is a very vague term, just meaning that it's a bomb that has a higher proportion of neutrons than say, another type of weapon. And we're working on all of these, and there's nothing intrinsic in the whole field that suggests that there would be any discontinuity or any breakthrough. Now, with respect to the gravity bomb, that's too vague a concept. I don't believe I'd be able to make any meaningful comment on that.
Do you foresee a continued growth in Hanford's role as sort of a catalyst between the AEC and industry?
Yes. Certainly in the area of the development of the fast breeder, Hanford will play a key and a continuing role in that.
What long-range implications might the breeder reactor development have?
Well, I think the best way for me to answer that is just to point out that the breeder reactor will probably be the reactor of the future, that as we get into the 1980s, breeder reactors will begin to take over more and more. Well, we'll begin building a higher and higher proportion of breeder reactors. And a site that has a central role in the breeder reactor development, like Hanford does, therefore, will certainly play an important role in that area. I should say that the fast breeder reactor, which is the part of the breeder reactor development in which Hanford is engaged, is not the only approach to the breeder reactor. There are other approaches, so that it is difficult at this time to predict which one will play the dominant role. Maybe not any single approach will. Maybe there will be several approaches.
General Groves and Dr. Seaborg, do either of you recall any particular reactions or reservations you might have had during the work before as to the implications of what you're doing?
No, I don't think so. Anybody, at least in my position, I had a responsibility, along with the Secretary of War and the Chief of Staff and the President, to save as many lives of American soldiers as possible. And no one could have any reservations about that mission. And anyone who had any doubts about it, all he had to do, as I told General Marshall on one occasion, was to think back to the Bataan March. And the other thing that has never been emphasized in the writings in this country is the fact that we not only saved upwards of 1 million American casualties, nobody knows how many, but we also saved about 10 times as many Japanese casualties, almost all of whom would have been killed. That was judging from the way that they resisted on Okinawa, particularly, and Iwo Jima. Okinawa particularly because it was a non-military population. And there was nothing that would have ended it without actual landing on the island of Hanoi, where Tokyo, Honshu where Tokyo is, than actual landing of troops. That meant we had to capture Kyushu. And it was just a terrible thing to contemplate in American losses. because they were prepared and they would have fought to the last ditch, even if, as in Okinawa, it meant 100 Japanese being killed for every 2 Americans. So, go ahead. I think that some of the scientific people, and I can't speak for Dr. Seaborg, I never thought that he felt that way. There were a few that would stop and think once in a while, isn't this a terrible thing? But after all, there are an awful lot of American lives involved.
Yes, I felt that this was the only thing to do at the time. We sincerely thought that we were in a race with the Nazis. Nuclear fission had been discovered in Germany. We thought that we were therefore in a race for survival. Whoever got the atomic bomb first would certainly have the upper hand. And I might add, General Groves, that during the time while we were working on the atomic bomb, there were very few scientists who had qualms about it. They all felt that this was something we had to do under the circumstances.
That's right, and the first qualms appeared, with the exception of about 2 people, one of whom was an engineer and a Quaker. The first qualms really appeared at the University of Chicago group after the surrender of the Germans. And that was due to the feeling that we no longer were in a race with the Germans, and that the Japanese couldn't possibly develop it. And it was also due to the fact that the leaders in that movement were essentially people who had a bitter enmity towards Hitler and all his works, because they were the ones who were refugees from Europe. And that undoubtedly had an influence on them. Now, there was never that feeling, I never discerned any of that feeling at the University of California, where the people involved were more acquainted with the Pacific Ocean. There are a lot of people in the eastern part of the country, as you know, that don't realize that there is a Pacific coast or Pacific Ocean or anything west of about 50 miles from New York City. And those are the people that once Germany surrendered, they really weren't interested in anything else, unless they had a boy or a husband in the army due to land on Japan. Then they were vitally interested. I think that really expressed. You were in Chicago at the time, weren't you?
Yes, I was in Chicago at the time.
General Groves, did you ever consider this feeling among the scientists serious enough that you took official notice or any official action?
Oh, yes, because they presented, some of them sent a petition in to the president, which came through my hands, and I saw to it that it was delivered to the Secretary of War. I discussed their feeling with the Secretary, and of course was responsible for this special group of scientific advisors to the interim committee, and they came up, I think Lawrence and Fermi and Oppenheimer, and there was one...
And I think Compton.
And Arthur Compton. They were on this committee, and they came up with the answer that they saw nothing else to do. And of course that was, I would say, those were our leaders in every sense of the word at that time. They were the big men in the project from the scientific standpoint.
General Groves, what do you think were going to result if somebody had beaten us with a A-bomb?
Why, we'd be reporting to Berlin without any question. There's no doubt about it. Just as if we had had the Hitler ideas after the war, we could have become the dominant power in the world with nobody ever raising a finger. Because anyone who had this weapon and had it alone could just dictate whatever he wanted.
Sir, he's saying that the A-bomb then was responsible for the peace we did have, how uneasy it might be?
Oh yes, very definitely. Otherwise, the only other way that peace could have been kept would have been to station about 2 million Americans in Europe.
General, do you feel that the A-bomb or the H-bomb still plays that role?
Well, it does in a different sense today because what it developed was this. As soon as two powers got it, each one knew the other one that they would be destroyed if they ever used it. And that is, while it's a piece of, you might say, based on fear, why usually peace has been based on fear. But today, in former years, the people that started wars always thought they could get a cheap, easy, and quick victory. And they know with the atomic bomb, or the H-bomb in existence today, it will not be cheap because they will be destroyed, as well as the enemy. And that is the basic reason why it isn't, I don't fear nuclear war in my lifetime. The only way it could happen, in my opinion, would be for us to become so imbued with the theory of not taking care of ourselves that we wouldn't maintain the means to repel an attack and to launch one at the same time. But this is nothing, nobody, even Hitler would never have started this, the war that he did. Now, he might have used bombs at the tail end of the war when he knew he was gone. He might have done it then as a matter of mad revenge, but nobody would ever start this thing in his right mind, and I think if anyone did start it, that the people around him would try to stop it.
Dr. Seaborg, there's a considerable concern at this point on the effects of nuclear power reactors on the environment. And there are a number of bills in Congress involving Federal Power Commission. So what do you would hope to see as the Atomic Energy Commission's role in licensing and regulating nuclear power reactors?
Oh, this is still under discussion, both in Congress and in the agencies of the executive branch of our government. I don't think at this stage that the Atomic Energy Commission has evolved a definitive position.
I'd just like to add something to that, and that is that I think it would be a terrible thing for the country if the Atomic Energy Commission was removed from the saying whether a plant should be built or not from the standpoint of safety. I know Dr. Seaborg can't speak right now, but I can on that. I don't belong to any government operation. You don't even have to comment.
Both of you gentlemen, you there is any real substantial threat has come with the power reactors, or is this feeling exaggerated?
Well,
Go ahead, I didn't hear it.
the question was whether there was any substantial threat from nuclear power reactors, or is this feeling exaggerated? My answer to that would be that when a nuclear power reactor has gone through the AEC licensing process, which is a very stringent process indeed, involving a review by the regulatory part of the AEC, an independent review by a very tough-minded, mighty independent committee of advisory committee of reactor safeguards, a public hearing by a three-man board that includes someone expert in conducting hearings as chairman and two scientists, and then where anybody who has a stake in it, a reason to, can intervene and have his say, and then a final review, if necessary, by the Atomic Energy Commission, all before a construction permit can be issued, and then a similar procedure after the reactor has been built before an operating license can be issued. I think that after all of this has been gone through, that it is a safe operation.
The present licensing procedure does not include such things as protection of the environment.
You know, that's the issue that partially responded to a moment ago. The present licensing procedure is now the role of the AEC is confined to determinations concerning radiological health and safety in the common defense and security. And the additional issues that are developing have to do with such things as the ownership of the plant and the possible participation of small utilities, public utilities, and the matter of thermal effects, and the general area of aesthetics and conservation. And these are the issues that are under investigation now, and which I'm sure will be resolved in the not-too-distant future.
Concerning possible proliferation of plutonium, would it worry you about the AEC Richland and Japan produced its first plutonium-239 power reactor?
Well, Japan, yes, any power reactor produces plutonium-239, but the plutonium that Japan produces is under safeguards. Has been under what we call bilateral safeguards, where we have been involved, and we have been involved in all except one reactor, and I believe the United Kingdom was involved in the other, and that involved safeguards. And then ours have been transferred to IAEA, and I guess the United Kingdom was transferred before ours, or about the same time. IAEA, by that I mean the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. So no, I don't worry in situations where reactors are under safeguards, and that's why I think the Non-Proliferation Treaty is so important.
There are countries where such plutonium would not be under safeguards.
It's a complicated situation. There are a few countries. Many of them are building nuclear power as a result of reactors as a result of a bilateral agreement with the United States or the United Kingdom. Some have relationships. The Eastern European countries have relationships with the Soviet Union of the same kind. And these effectively are under safeguards. A number are under safeguards directly, but by their own choice, in the absence of a non-proliferation treaty, to the International Atomic Energy Agency. There are a few countries, however, that have reactors, usually small ones at this stage, that use, say, natural uranium that they got independently of any of these sources that I've suggested, and other materials whose acquisition didn't require cooperation with one of these countries, and therefore are now in a position of being not under safeguards. These are not a large number of cases, and they're usually small reactors. However, if we went on this way very long, we could reach what the United States regards to be a serious situation. And that is why we are working so hard to attain a non-proliferation treaty. And we regard this as very, very important.
Dr. Seaborg, the Congress is looking now at a $6 billion tax cut. What was having the effect on the July meeting on the biology lab, or the scheduling and timetable for the FSP?
I'd have to answer that it could. We don't know yet. We haven't worked out our allotment. We're in the process of doing that at the present time. This $6 billion cut will be divided among the agencies and departments in order to come up with that sum. And the Atomic Energy Commission will have a certain allotment to reach, and some suggestions made as to where those cuts should be made, both in Congress and at the executive level. I don't know at this time whether it will or not. I'd have to answer your question, though, that it could. It's possible. Postponement, though, that would be postponement. If it affected the biology laboratory, for example, it would presumably be no more than a postponement in the schedule of its construction. And in the case of the FFTF, even at this stage, I don't believe it's too likely that even that will happen, because that's a bigger project, more involved in our whole operation, and would have a larger impact nationally, and is not likely to be, therefore, slowed down, is likely to enjoy a high priority in most of these places that I mentioned, or perhaps all of them.
How can a non-proliferation treaty control production of nuclear weapons, for instance, in China and other countries that won't try?
Well, it won't control it in China if China doesn't agree, and it won't control it in any country that figures out a scheme to get around it. But in general, it will accomplish, I think, what we tried to accomplish in the first international negotiations, and really started in 1945 at the tail end, when Secretary Burns went to Moscow with Dr. Conant as an advisor. I'd forgotten he had one other, but Conant was the principal one. And we discussed that very seriously before they left. And the whole purpose was to try to arrive at some system whereby this weapon would be controlled. And of course, one of the dangers is having a lot of small powers get them, because a small power could maybe start off the war just as they've started off wars in the past. After all, it was a small power that really started the war in World War I.
What chances do you see that China might start such a war with bombs already?
Well, I don't know. China has some bombs. Nobody knows how many. All I can say is you get certain military intelligence, but having been involved in that during the war and trying to find out about the Germans, military intelligence, you have certain positive information, and you have a lot that you don't know about. And I don't think we know too much about China. We know certain things. But all we can depend on is that as China becomes more industrialized and therefore capable of doing such a thing, they'll tend to get like Russia, and that is the people demand, the women will demand cosmetics. As you know, Russia, the big trouble in Russia today from the Russian standpoint is that instead of devoting all their effort to making Russia powerful militarily, they have to worry about women's costumes, and just as we do over here. And just how much effort will go into that, I don't know, but it's what we always hoped for. As soon as the war was over, it was my philosophy, and that I think of people that I was advising at the time, Mr. Burns and Mr. Stimson, and that was that it wasn't so important for us to get into Russian. We want the Russians to come over and see how we lived and then take the word back. And I think that's what's eventually happened. As you know, after the war, they would take troop units who would come into contact with the Americans, ship them to Siberia for about 6 months indoctrination, strip them of all their wristwatches and all the other things that they'd gotten from Americans, and then gradually discharge them. So they'd go out one at a time, and then nobody would believe the stories they told. They'd say, "Where is this watch that you told us about?" And that was it.
Now, Seaboard, the reduction of plutonium output, do you view that as a more or less permanent condition now, or is it something that's linked directly to the state of world tension?
Which the reduction in the production?
of plutonium.
Well, it's certainly linked to the present overall situation. As I said, it's under continuous review. It is conceivable that with the dynamic nature of nuclear weapons, that it could go up as well as down. I just don't know. I wouldn't predict that, but then I have to, I'm basing my prediction on the situation, of course, that prevailed that led to the reduction.
Dr. Seaboard, there have been two nuclear-powered submarines, especially the Scorpion, have been lost and not recovered. What possibility is there that the losses are equal to the failure of the nuclear system?
Well, you're in an area now where I wouldn't really have the required expertise. My own impression is that it's unlikely that it was due to the failure of the nuclear system. The nuclear system is built in such a reliable manner and is of such a nature that, in my view, this would be a less likely explanation for it.
Gentlemen, our time is running out. I think we have time for one more question.
Here's a man.
Dr. Seaboard, what is your feelings on the development of a nuclear-powered rocket?
Well, I would hope that we can go ahead with the development of the nuclear-powered rocket at the proper time.
Who would be the proper time?
I think that we are now on a kind of a schedule that would probably lead us to acquiring a nuclear rocket capability in the 1980s, and I believe we should try to maintain that schedule. By that I mean a capability that would enable men to travel in nuclear-powered rockets by the 1980s.
Dr. Seaboard, do you have an announcement on the feature?
Oh, yes. We have a feature story on Hanford, which we're going to release to the press for the first time this morning. And I believe Mr. Williams and Mr. Stokely have that story ready for you here. I think that you will find this very interesting, and this attempts to put into perspective the role that Hanford has played over the years and will play in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Seaboard and General Groves. Thank you.
The bus is outside. We'll give you about 10 minutes to break down your gear and get aboard.